The following is a conversation with Misha Zelinski. Misha is a Fulbright scholar, national security expert, and currently war correspondent for the Australian Financial Review. Misha has been one of the most constant Australian voices in Ukraine throughout the duration of this war, and therefore in this chat, Misha tells us what it's like living in Ukraine, what it's like traveling throughout a war zone, what it's like meeting Sean Penn and then the Klitschko brothers as well, what it was like doing a profile on his namesake, Volodymyr Zelensky, a day in the life in Lviv, an interesting Taiwan parallel, and then as well his overall musings on the progress of the war. Misha also hosts his own terrifically puns named Diplomates. This is a podcast about geopolitics and national security, and I've left a link to it in the podcast description. And that's all for the introduction. So please do hang around to the end for my afterthoughts and my ambition for the podcast, because this podcast took me 5 hours to put together, but it would only take you 5 seconds to review. So swipe up your phones now. Bring up the applications, whether it's Spotify, Apple, any of the good ones. Pump your attention and juice into the various algorithms. 5 stars on Spotify, 5 stars in a review on Apple. Just general niceties in every single direction. And let's bring the Spotify reviews to over 100 before next week. But overall, just pump that good juice into the algorithm. And without any further ado, here is the amazing Misha Zelinski. Soon after the war began, you had this guest on your podcast, Pavlov. What was it like sitting in his kitchen, having what would otherwise just be a regular chat, knowing that the undertones were that he was about to go off to war?
Well, it was profound because it was in the context of the war just breaking out. So I'd actually agreed to catch up with Pablo before the war had broken out. So it was an interview that I'd scheduled prior to the outbreak. And the reason I wanted to catch up with him was at the time, I've been sort of operating on the basis that if Vladimir Putin was to invade, and at that point we still weren't too sure, though the intelligence seemed to indicate it was going to happen, but if he did invade, that he might be able to take Ukraine, but he wouldn't be able to hold Ukraine. And my thesis for that was he only really had 200,000 troops, essentially not enough troops, and Russia's economy was too small. It's a medium-sized economy, it's only about the size of Australia's, would not be able to occupy a pretty big country in Ukraine, large landmass, 45 million people. The best example of anyone that attempted in recent history was the United States tried it. And of course, they were unable, as a sole hyperpower in the world, unable to occupy Afghanistan and in Iraq with any meaningful sense, and in the end had to withdraw, as we know, last year. So that was the base of my thinking that there might be an insurgency, and someone like Pavlo would be involved in something like that. Now, as it turns out, that was not the case. But we know now that not only could Russia not hold Ukraine, it can't even take Ukraine. We can talk about that. But I was on my way to see him, and he was heading to Dnipro on a train in a few hours. So he said, "Look, I've got a couple of hours, come see me." So I ran down there, quite literally, and things were starting to heat up. So you saw the city had not yet been attacked itself, but all the outskirts that had been bombed in the airports and other parts, and the Russians were starting to come closer. And so you started to see lines building at the ATMs, lines at pharmacies, and tension in the city emerging, lines at petrol stations, and then traffic starting to build as people wanted to get out. So sitting there with Pablo was, I guess, a surreal experience, but also incredibly profound one for me. And anyone who hasn't listened to the episode, he essentially makes a plea to the world saying, are you prepared to stand up for democracy? Are you prepared to stand up for the rights of individuals to be free from persecution, oppression, and murder? Ukrainians were facing the fight of their lives, and really people like Pavel looking to other democracies to say, well, you're going to come help us in this struggle and in this fight. And it was very much in the balance at this point. No one really knew what would happen. So the premise of our interview changed, obviously, in 24 hours, and his personal circumstances changed. And so being with someone that might be on their way to risk their life was an extraordinarily powerful moment for me. And I'll never forget as we left and concluded the interview, and then we parted ways. I said, "Well, how can I continue to help?" And he said, "Keep telling our stories." And so it was a promise that I made to myself in that interview, that at the end of that interview, and a promise to him personally, but it was a broader promise to people of Ukraine, is continue to tell the stories of Ukraine and Ukrainians in their struggle for freedom and the struggle for Ukrainian democracy, but I think also global democracy. And so it's one that I've tried to uphold every day. We correspond via text. He's okay, all things considered. Obviously, it's a tough time there right now. But he's a great man, a really great guy. And, I really think about his safety every day, actually.
Take us back to those early days. You mentioned how things were starting to heat up and the tension was building, lines out of ATMs, lines out of to get out of the city. You were in both Kiev and Lviv and presumably a lot of other places through the country over the last 8 months. So not to give us just a timeline, but those early days, the tension building up to the invasion and then the immediate days after, just what it was like for us who weren't there to help us understand.
Right. Well, I guess the starting point is when I arrived in Kiev. Now, I flew straight into Kiev. I probably would have been one of the last people to manage to do that. I got to Kiev, I think, 4 days before the war broke out. So I saw literally what life was like prior to the war. And it was a bit of a surreal experience, to be honest. Kiev, for anyone hasn't been there, it's a fabulous city. It's a very cosmopolitan, could be like any other European capital. And I was certainly reading all the news before I went there, and there's all this talk of Russian invasion, 200,000 troops on the north, south, and eastern borders of Ukraine, the expectation that war could break out at any moment. And yet, in Kiev itself, the city was vibrant. There was no sense of any danger. Restaurants, bars, shopping centres were full. People were having a good time, for lack of a better way of expressing it. And there was a sense of whether or not you might call it willful blindness or hoping for the best. But, all my Ukrainian friends and people that I met were certainly saying, this is all just kind of drama. They were laughing at me like, well, yeah, in the sense that, look, I think there's an element too that there was this ongoing conflict with Russia since 2014. You had the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, the occupation there, and then also the civil wars that were started, so-called civil wars, but essentially Russian separatist wars, Russian-backed wars in the Donbass, in Luhansk and Donetsk. So they had 8 years of fighting. And so there was a sense that this was going to be more of the same, I think, a little bit. There wasn't going to be this large-scale conflict that we've subsequently seen. And I think also there was an element of perhaps not wanting to provoke or escalate tensions by talking about it. And again, you can't blame them. They were certainly hoping that it wouldn't happen. And regrettably, we've seen what has happened. But it was extraordinarily surreal to be there in the epicenter of it at the same time. It felt as though there was more concern on the outside than there was on the inside. And that was a slightly bizarre thing. And then, of course, Vladimir Putin gave a speech, I think from memory, on the 21st of February, where he formally recognized the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. And that was really the trigger point for the war. Having watched that speech and listening to it in Russian, I knew that we were in a fair bit of trouble at that point, those of us that were there, because it was clear that this was an emotional war for Putin. This wasn't like a cold-hearted strategic decision he was making. It was visceral and emotional, guttural, this speech he gave. And I often think back to vision. You look back at vision of Hitler hitting the lectern, he says hair flopping around, and that kind of like a real sort of guttural type speeches. And it was not dissimilar from Putin. We've seen similar speeches from him over the course of the last 8 months, but that was the first one he gave that was of that type. And I thought to myself, geez, okay, this is going to actually be a proper invasion now. I still wasn't sure what scope of it would be, whether he would actually try for Kiev, which he did, but nevertheless, you knew that this was going to not be a small incursion of the likes we saw previously. So the day after that speech in Kiev, there was an incredible outpouring of sort of peace and emotional pushback on that speech. Everyone was praying for peace, begging for peace. There was an impromptu concert given right on the Klitschko Bridge, which is this sort of land bridge that crosses over the Dnipro River and overlooks overlooks Kiev as a city. It's a beautiful footbridge, and it's where the Freedom Arch is. The Friendship Arch, rather, where previously it's been taken down there. But there was a statue of a Ukrainian and a Russian soldier embracing in friendship. Now, the Ukrainians, unsurprisingly, have taken that statue down. But essentially, Ukraine's Mick Jagger came and gave he's a lead singer of the band called Uninterested. He gave a impromptu speech. He's a politician kind of figure as well, and gave a speech and sung a bunch of songs, which I've now come to know quite well. So Uninterested is pretty much the most successful band of the post-Soviet era in Ukraine. And so this was the mood. The mood in the city was, I guess, went from suspended disbelief to praying and celebrating and Ukrainian culture, but this outburst of wanting peace. And that was an incredible mood in the city. And then 24 hours later, the next day, less than 24 hours later, you had the missile attacks, etc. And then I went and saw Pavlo the way that I described. So there was this huge shift in the mood from it's not going to happen. Oh my God, it might happen. It really shouldn't. How crazy could it be that we're going to have a land war in Europe? How could this possibly be happening? To now it's happening, and the tension building and this real fluid sense of no one knowing what would happen. Because now, if you went to Ukraine, now it's tough there right now with power outages, etc. But you can pretty much assess where the battle lines are, where the Russians are, where the Ukrainians are, and it's pretty not static, but it's well understood where the front lines are. There were no front lines at this point. It was moving very quickly. Information was imperfect, and where Kiev is located, it's about 400 kilometers from the border to Belarus to the north. And the Russians had assembled, essentially Belarus is a client state of the Russians. And so they, were only a few hundred kilometers away. So they crossed into Ukraine, and you're watching the updates, and they're 300 kilometers away, 200 kilometers away, 100 kilometers away, 50 kilometers away, 10 kilometers away, right? The Russians got, I think, 5 kilometers from my hotel before I ended up leaving. So that was the sense. It was this very fluid sense of where the Russians were, and the Ukrainians were, live updates of the fighting. And I think we'll look back on, it was a critical fight for the airport just outside of Kyiv, which denied the Russians an air bridge, and it's a fancy military term, essentially being able to send paratroopers, etc., into Kyiv. And that was probably the difference, because the Russians had banked on taking that airport. They took it, the Gomstop airport. The Ukrainians took it back, and then that gave the Ukrainians, I think, the capacity to consolidate.
And I think you tweeted smoke coming out of that airport at the time.
Right. So there was huge, I guess, hand-to-hand combat going on in that airport, and the Ukrainians pushed them out incredibly. And that, in combination with the fact that Zelensky didn't leave the capital, I think you can't quite put a price on that. I often think back to Winston Churchill didn't leave London; he stayed. When you set up a government in exile and you leave, it's hard to convince the soldiers and the public to fight on if you're not prepared to stay with them. So I think that bravery, you can't quite price it. You don't know what it meant, but I think it was kind of definitive. And you look at, not the same example, not the same countries, but the Afghani president fled as the Taliban were coming, and the place disintegrated inside a week. Now, I don't think that's a like-for-like comparison, but it does give you a sense of what happened. What the power of leadership is important in these moments. So that's stiffened up the morale of the country, I think, and they rallied to their president, as we've now seen. But at the time, no one quite knew whether or not Zelensky would stay. Would he go to Lviv? Would he go to Poland? And he was clearly getting advice to leave. There's a famous quote, as we all know now, which is, I need ammunition, not a ride. And that'll be a legendary quote. Yeah. Right, and that'll be a legendary quote forever. It's up there with anything that Churchill ever said. So So that was a sort of that mood on the ground, that unpredictability. But then also you had this huge pouring of refugees west, just desperately getting out. And, talking about, 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 3 Ukrainians have been displaced from their homes. So it's a huge number of people, talking about somewhere between 10 and 15 million people. It's a huge amount of people. So that was going on as well, this sort of chaos of people trying to get out. And what's a 6-hour drive to Lviv becoming a 45-hour drive? So you can imagine that sense. And the Russian army bearing down, and it, at least at the time, was considered to be the second most powerful army in the world. So that was the mood. And I probably has a long answer, but it was that sense of kind of suspended disbelief to we don't want this to happen. How could this happen? To tension and panic and fluid fighting. And it was well, the resolve came, I think, incredibly. The resolve came, I think. I've spoken to Ukrainians about this, through the fact that they were given no chance to succeed. So the conventional wisdom was that Ukraine could hang on for 24 to 72 hours. And Putin had clearly banked on this 24-hour strategy that he would knock over the Zelensky government, have Zelensky march down the street and get a puppet regime in place, sign a inverted commas peace treaty, and get invited in, right? And his tanks roll in because they've been invited, and then he dares the West to come get him. And you play that scenario out, that might have, I think, to be honest, I think the West would have folded in that scenario had he prevailed. But of course, wars are fought with live ammunition, not on paper. And so as a result, it fell apart for him. But that confidence, when you're in there, and also when you talk to Ukrainians now, they were 24 hours later, we're still here. 48 hours later, we're still here. 72 hours later, we're still here. And so every hour, every day that Ukraine hung in and Kiev had not been captured, it gave them more confidence to keep fighting. And frankly, I think shamefully, it gave the West the confidence to start imposing sanctions and start sending weapons. Because it was after 24 hours, 48 hours, everyone said, geez, we might have underestimated these Ukrainians. They're actually fighting really well. And again, in war, right, it's like when you're defending your homeland versus on some sort of mission, and various reports have showed us that the Russians didn't even know quite why they were there. It's a training exercise. They were there to liberate. They were going to be welcomed like heroes, all these things. When you compare and contrast that level of morale and intensity, it's not surprising in many ways the Ukrainians have fought so well. But I think that the fact no one gave them a chance, and the fact that they turned it around themselves, has just built such confidence in the people there.
Mm. The force of Zelensky is an incredible intangible, and like, what if he had fled?
Right.
You said in the Josh Zepps interview this quote from Napoleon about morale. I can't remember it now. If you want to say it quickly.
Oh, well, essentially, Napoleon said that morale is worth more than all other factors of war combined. So size of your army,
there you go,
capability, the training, etc. So morale is worth more than all those things.
And that, then tied on top of the Zelensky staying there, does create this giant intangible that could give some sort of explanation for why they've done so well. I don't know.
Well, we'll never know, right? It's kind of pub politics, so to speak. Muhammad Ali versus Mike Tyson. But I definitely think it helped. And you can't price it, of course. But I think the idea that if you're a leader, you're asking people to fight and die for their country, but you're going to leave the capital. It just doesn't exactly breed confidence, because if you think about it, information is asymmetric. So the public, no less than the politicians, and if they think to themselves, look, the president's clearly got no confidence, he's hightailing it out of here, why would we stick around? Well, right, exactly. Whereas he says, you know what, no way, I'm staying. And he's bravely, knowing that there are assassins after him, mind you, taking videos of himself on the streets of Kiev saying, I'm here, come get me, come get us. I mean, that is a jolt of inspiration, I think, to the public. And again, when it's in the balance, when people are thinking, do I stay, do I run? When you've had this surge of adrenaline, as I was explaining, that shift of emotion that they had, and they say, you know what, our president's staying. You know what, bugger this. We've had it with these Russian bullies. We're going to, stand once and for all against them.
Mm.
I think those things matter, and I think it's played out that way.
This might be a too much of a parallel question that could derail the chat, but nonetheless, I mean, do you see a parallel between Taiwan and Ukraine? That sense of the restaurants are full and life is normal the day before the invasion actually happens. I was speaking to Angelica Ung, who's a Taiwanese journalist. She's been a guest several times, and she says she just is walking around. People just discount China as a non-factor. It could never happen, but then of course it might eventually happen.
Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. People want to draw the parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan, and they're natural parallels because both are democracies, both are under threat from a neighbor and I guess a fraternal neighbor, if you want. Yeah, a fraternal neighbor, if you want to call it that. So it's the same sort of contest of similarly composed populations and with histories that are linked in some ways, and one's a small democracy and one's been menaced by an autocracy. I think ultimately, though, what do you do in that scenario? You got to plan for the worst and hope for the best. So people often say to me, how is it that people living their lives in Ukraine? Well, you got to get on with things. And so I think, if you look at Taiwanese, they'd be right to arm themselves because, you don't need to believe me or believe those that are concerned about it. Believe Xi Jinping. He's the one that said that, Taiwan will be unified with the mainland one way or another by 2049, if not earlier, and has said that military force is an option in that struggle. So, I think they'd be completely crazy not to be taking those threats seriously, particularly in the light of what we've seen from Putin. But on the flip side, I'd say this, and people don't agree with me necessarily when I say this, but I think the invasion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine makes the invasion of Taiwan slightly less likely. And the reason why I say that is this, because, as I said, wars are not fought on paper, they are fought with live ammunition. And Xi Jinping will be looking at Putin going, geez, you had this beautiful strategy, probably that he told him all about at the Beijing Olympics when they signed off on this no limits friendship. And he said, listen, don't worry, it'll all be over in 24 hours. Now, the Chinese and the PLA are running a similar strategy, but they think they can get in there, knock it over quickly, and be in charge of the Taiwanese island before the Americans can get there, and essentially say, okay, we're in control of Taiwan now. If you want to free Taiwan, you have to stage a land invasion, and that'd be a very difficult thing for the United States to do. So they're trying to push particularly the Indo-Pac fleet out further and further and further using missile technology, and then hope to stage a real kind of a blitzkrieg effort on the Taiwanese. But as we've seen with Ukraine, these things don't play out necessarily in that fashion. And if you took a bet at the beginning, if I said to you, which regime was going to hold out longer, the Ukrainians or the Taiwanese? If you looked at the way both were relatively armed, you look at the fact that Taiwan's got a maritime border, you'd say, well, obviously the Taiwanese can hang on a lot longer than the Ukrainians. Well, the Ukrainians have hung on now into nearly 250 days. And so things could go real pear-shaped real quickly for Xi Jinping if he staged a land invasion. And, it'd be urban warfare, be all kinds of things. And so, I think the Ukrainian war would be giving him pause for thought. He'd be looking at the sanctions going, is this really worth it? Where you can actually extract a lot of the things that you wanted. You look at the things that were offered to Putin in the Minsk II Accords, which were keep Crimea and some level of autonomy for the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. That he'd be lucky to get that now, and it's cost him all the prestige of his armies. It's cost him enormous humiliations now, huge damage to his economy, and not to mention the fact that he fears encirclement by NATO. Well, Sweden and Finland are joining NATO, right? So it's a disaster on any measure for Russia for very little gain. And you could see it going in a similar way for Xi and the Chinese Communist Party. So that's probably a long answer there, but I think the Taiwanese themselves, they got to try to live their lives as best as they can, while at the same time, hoping that cooler heads will prevail. But
Yeah.
what can you do? I mean, ultimately, you might be concerned about China
Mm.
invading, but at the same time,
Life goes
you can't.
on.
You got to put your
Yeah.
pants on every day, and you got to go to
Yeah.
work, right? So it is a weird thing when you are, and they're in a. Yeah, I guess it's kind of similar to what I was explaining in Kiev. Now that's not anywhere near that level of alert, but they've got this not an acute threat, but a more of a kind of long term threat coming.
Mm.
But you,
Mm.
you can't just curl up into a ball, right? You got to get on with it. So that
Yeah.
is the tension there for them. But I would certainly, if I was Taiwanese, be asking my government to be arming the country as best as possible.
A little bit more about your particular experience in Ukraine. How's it felt as a journalist covering this war? You started in Kiev, Lviv, you've done trips throughout the whole country, but living it every day for such a long time. How's it felt watching the general interest sort of pulsate and then wane when you're there feeling like this is the only thing that matters right now? Why the fuck is people not paying more attention? How
Right.
was that felt?
Look, I mean, it is tricky because on the one hand, I don't think anything could ever replicate the shock that people felt in that first 24 hours, week, 2 weeks, a month of the war. The pictures were just things that we'd never seen in a long, long time. Now, people, of course, then, I can already see my Twitter mentions lighting up saying, well, you're not talking about Yemen or other conflicts, and there's all sorts of horrible things happening all around the world. And that is true. And the truth of the matter is, there are a lot of things competing for people's attention. But in terms of the stakes of this conflict, I think they're as high as they could possibly be. I say what happens in Ukraine matters everywhere. So Australia is a small democracy, 25 million people. We occupy a continent. We're a long way away from a lot of our friends, and we're in an uncertain region. And so the last thing we want to see is that democracy start getting gobbled up by autocrats because they make some narrative up saying, well, actually, because of some silly story that I'm making up and the history as I define it, I'm entitled to invade this country. Now, that can't be good for Australia. In a might is right world, that is bad for Australia. So we're a middle power, and we need, I'm a unionist as well. We need to hang together, right? Strength in numbers. Um, I think, people are paying attention as much as they can, but there's a lot of things competing for our attention. I'm someone that worries about democracy globally, so I've been watching very closely, for example, what's happening in U.S. midterms, and hoping that Trumpism can be pushed out and pushed back completely out of U.S. democracy. So there's lots of things. I get why people feel also at times, what can you do? So that at the beginning, people wanted to help. There's lots of things they could do. There's still things you can do to help. But the war's gone through iterations as well in Ukraine. So we had this first, as I said, that big fluid phase. Then I think the next big phase was Ukraine winning the battle for Kiev. And then you saw the war essentially, Russia said, well, we're going to focus on the east. And it was, euphemism, grinding phase of the war. It was a lot of very, very intense fighting where maybe thousands of people were dying a day at time in a very small location. And so the lines in the map weren't moving around, and the news didn't seem as, I suppose, profound. And so people weren't paying as close attention. Then we had the threats of nuclear warfare, which I think got people's attention again. And then we've had this incredible counter-offensives in the northeast and now the south and Kherson. And so, again, I think people's attentions ebb and flow. But I've never felt anyone not caring about Ukraine and saying, oh, can we change the channel and want this to end? I just think it competes with a lot of other valid things that are happening, and people are
Mm.
worried about all kinds of things. The world's complicated, and it feels like it's going faster and faster and faster. But the stakes of Ukraine, I think, are so profound that we can't afford to look away.
Mm. On that same topic, what were the conversations like between you and the fellow journalists, say in Lviv, at lunch, at dinner, late at night, on that exact topic?
Look, I think particularly in that early phase where pretty much it felt like every single journalist in the world was in Lviv, Ukraine was the center of the universe, so to speak, and on a news basis. there was almost an insatiable demand for information and insight and communication out of there, because Lviv was really the only safe place in Ukraine at that point. Everyone was flowing east. As I said, millions and millions of people were going into Europe, really using Lviv as a staging point. So the city was just pulsating with refugees and journalists. And so the amount of energy in the place, and fear as well from Ukrainians, rightly scared about what was happening. You didn't really need to talk to journalists to everyone shared the view that this was the most important thing going on. And I think that probably the most interesting thing when I spoke to a lot of journalists was that was never, you can take your pick of any issue. A lot of journalists will rightly take a contrarian view or want to both sides things and say, well, there's this view and then there's that view. And, it's certainly not how I've reported on it. I've taken a pretty clear-eyed moral position that Russia's invasion of this is unacceptable, and that the Putin regime is corrupt, kleptocratic, and war criminals, right? So they are the bad guys, frankly. Right, but I think one of the more surprising things in all this is that you'd be hard pressed to find in mainstream reporting those that don't report it in that fashion. It is a very clear-cut moral conflict, and it's ironic given Putin tends to like to muddy the waters here about his grievances and why he had to do certain things. And I think in other areas he's had more purchase in the debate around this thing. I think people have taken that viewpoint more seriously, and I think you go back and look at 2014 and the way they were able to seed a narrative that, well, Crimea was always Russian and it's very important strategically and they need it for their Black Sea fleet and blah, blah, blah. Whereas now I think they've completely lost that moral authority or any sense that people are taking Russian narrative seriously. And I think that was probably the thing that was most striking. As I speaking to other journalists, no one had a sense that the Ukrainians had provoked this or that there was any justification for what was happening. There was very much a complete outrage from the world, I think from journalists as well.
It's interesting how transparent that sort of fake news, that propaganda was to everyone else who wasn't in Russia. I wonder if there are other examples of propaganda ever being just so blatantly transparent for the majority. I don't expect you to know off the top of your head.
Well, it is an interesting question.
Yeah.
And I think the way the Russians have lost control of the narrative here has been quite interesting. I think it's probably one of the underappreciated elements of this war. You look at the way that the information space was shaped at the beginning, before the conflict. I think the Western allies took a view that typically in the past, Western governments know what the Russians are doing, but they haven't disclosed this intelligence with the public. And so Putin is putting out his narrative, and it's essentially uncontested. And on this occasion, what you saw was particularly the Five Eyes nations, but NATO as well, rapidly declassifying intelligence to say, here's what the Russians are doing, here's what we believe they're going to do, here's what they might do for a false flag, here's how they might stage an invasion. And that really wrong-footed Putin, because I think up until then, he'd never really experienced that rapid movement in the information space by the Western allies. Then, on top of that, after the invasion occurred, essentially this is the first smartphone war, and the Ukrainians have just dominated it. Because, again, I think it's a little bit of having, a degree of freedom and liberty to express yourself in democracies in Ukraine rather than what Russians are capable of. They've got a top-down approach, and they control that narrative through their troll farms, etc. But the Ukrainians have got 45 million advocates all using their phones, and they're tech savvy, and they're led by a tech savvy, information
super tech savvy. Most of Sweden's developers are Ukrainian.
Right.
There's an interesting relationship between Sweden and Ukraine. I don't know if you ever felt that down there, but
no. Well, it's one of the things that I notice is how tech savvy they are, and they're led by a guy who made his career in entertainment. So he understands how to communicate. Now, I think a lot of people underestimated Zelensky because, he's this Jewish comic come Churchill, he's playing a role. Well, he's actually a tough bastard from a tough town. I visited his hometown, Knivity. I wrote a piece about the town. And you can't come from a town like that, a real tough steel town, famous for its gangs, without really having a sense of toughness about you. So, but he's been able to dominate the information space, and so have the Ukrainians. And they've taken his lead, and I think that has been the real big thing that's come out of it. So many lessons, but the inability by the Russians to control the information space has really isolated them on the world stage and given the West the confidence to continue to assist, I think.
I imagine you would have felt extremely thinned out for especially the first month, but even maybe longer. You've since been able to return to Australia, but I just remember myself constantly looking for updates, constantly trying to figure out what's going on, feeling a sense of anxiety over it. And then as well, Alexander Kucherenko, who was the guy from Poltava I was telling you about, he was the same age as me. He's got a wife, he's got a kid, and overnight he's just this nerdy software developer who plays games. And all of a sudden he's genuinely defending his family, his life, his community. Just such a sort of, and he commented how thinned out he felt as well, and how the general feeling was how thinned out people were. So if you could talk about that a little bit, whether you did feel thinned out at any stage, and among the fellow journalists, I'm trying to get a sense for what it was like to be, non-Ukrainian, a journalist. Like, you've chosen to be there, yet you still become so involved in it, and how it affects you.
Yeah, it's hard not to get invested. I mean, the reason why I went there is because I care about the issues. I didn't feel I was going there as an observer. I've studied a Fulbright scholarship. I've followed this sort of rise of autocracy for a long time now, and so to me, this is the front line of this struggle. But in terms of being exhausted, you kind of were running on adrenaline, and I think the country was running on adrenaline for the first month or two, but there's limit to that. And so there was a lot of frenetic activity and people feeling like they had to do something. And so at the beginning, people were like running into refugee centers, just like holding bundles of clothes and bottles of water and just dumping them, then running away again. And there was just a lack of, I guess, order to it all. Like, there was a lot of energy and enthusiasm, but people were, sort of perhaps not directing their energies where they were most required. So eventually the government got a hold of that and were like, hang on, no, don't give us clothes. We've got enough clothes. We need these things. Help us with this. So we're able to start channeling that. But for me personally, one of the big challenges of being Australian was that, I'm filing into an Australian time zone, which is not the most friendly if you're in Eastern Europe. And I was also filing for MSNBC in the United States and BBC. So, and people would take as much as they want. Funny, right? So I remember, it might have been a week into the war, and I woke up and I had all these text messages and people, are you okay? You okay? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, oh, you haven't tweeted for like 4 hours. I'm like, yeah, I was asleep. Like, I don't know, people seem to think that I was like this 24-hour, tweet bot just putting out facts, which, I guess I was a little bit. I wasn't sleeping a great deal. To be honest, I was sleeping maybe an hour or three a night. But that's not sustainable, right? And most journalists will do rotations in there about 2 weeks. If you do any longer, starts to wear you down. I was there for nearly 2 months at the beginning, and I was pretty frazzled by the end. But at the same time, I did take a couple of times where I was like, I just got to not file or do anything for a day or two, just calm, get some sleep, But overall, I think, that there's been the mood of the country. Journalists, I think, feel a bit like that, but the mood of the country was shock, frazzled, frenetic energy, then determination, then elements of euphoria as they started to have success, winning the Battle of Kiev and these things. Then there was a lot of sadness. When I was chatting to my friends, when I was out of the country, I would talk to people and they were feeling tired and flat. And as described to me, one of my friends said to me, my Facebook feed is like an obituary. So every day you go on there and see the people that have died, and everyone now knows people that have died. Friends, family, neighbors, brothers, sisters. and that takes its toll as well, you know. But then now I think there's an element of complete determination, and you know, I think there's almost just this: no matter what Putin does, he's not going to break their will. Now he's trying to make their lives just shitful by bombing infrastructure like electricity and water, and just trying to make cities uninhabitable. But again, that won't deliver the dividend that he's after, which is to break Ukrainian spirit. It's just not going to happen.
No.
But overall, I think, you know, the mood ebbs and flows, unsurprisingly, because you talk about people and armies, it's just people, right? As you said, they're ordinary people who not too long ago were going about their lives, trying to support their families, do whatever it is that they were doing, and are now having to fight for their lives and their country and their families and their towns and their communities. So I think, you know, whenever I chat to them, they're very grateful for the support they're getting, and they're very thankful, and they're always happy to see foreigners in town to help, and I think they draw a lot of confidence out of that. But ultimately, their mission is a sacred one, and you can't put a price on people fighting for their freedom, fighting for their families, and you know, you always bet on that side if you're going to take a bet, because that tends to be where the victories are found.
Yeah. And a bit of your timeline. How long were you in Lviv for?
It's a good question, mate. So I think I was in Lviv. So I was in Kiev, I want to say, about the first week of the war. And then I was in Lviv for about the next 5-6 weeks. But then I was also going in and around the place. So I'd travel out for a couple of days and go look at cities that were safe enough to my family listening. Safe enough. But, you know, look, you make that risk assessment, try not to take crazy amounts of risk. But of course, obviously, the cities I went to, the Russians were not far away as well. So, and a missile strike is something you can never protect yourself from. But
you were exposed to some of them?
Yeah.
Wow.
I was in Lviv. I was actually doing a story on logistics and the deliveries coming in from Poland, because Lviv, for anyone that's not familiar, is about 75 kilometers from the Polish border. So it's the major city is the closest to the Polish border into Europe. And so I was keen to see what was coming in, and an oil refinery got hit, which was about half a kilometer from where I was. So there was a really loud explosion, and came out and saw that the Russians had hit it there. And the expectation was that, geez, they might come hit this facility next. So that was, and that was one example, but there was plenty of others where explosions happen pretty close.
But I just wanted to lead into how long were you in Lviv, just to ask, what is a day in the life like in a country at war? You know, now Lviv, as you explained, was actually, never mind. I don't need to preface it. What was the day in the life?
Oh, well, I mean, look, again, at the beginning in Lviv, I mean, you had curfews, right? So they had martial law and curfews. So you couldn't get a beer, which was horrendous. So if you were a bit stressed, you had to try to track down a contraband beer, which I was able to on an occasion, but broadly speaking, unable to have a beer of an evening. Most restaurants were closed at the beginning, and then gradually things started to reopen as the city got a little more confident that the Russians weren't on their way. As I recall, I think curfew was at 10 p.m., I think, every night. But it was pretty normal-ish in the sense that, okay, other than you knew that the city was at war and you're following those updates, you could go you could go buy food from a supermarket. The shelves weren't empty or anything like that. Sometimes things might be a little limited in terms of certain products or produce, but generally speaking, you could get what you needed. You get coffee. I mean, I had coffee every day. Ukrainians love their coffee. It's actually where coffee first entered Europe, was through
How about
Ukraine.
that?
Yeah. So it was the Ottomans gave them a bunch of coffee. So you know, the war's not being fought there. The war's being fought on the front line. So the effort and energy in the city goes to trying to keep the economy going, keep the things that need to happen going. So the functions of government, the functions of supply chains, the functions of business. And I remember there was the mayor of Lviv at one point said, "Look, this is a major city. We need to keep our economy going as best as we can." And so he would encourage people to try to remain calm. And yes, look, there were missile strikes, but at the same time, the efforts of what was happening by keeping life and the economy going as normally as possible was assisting the frontline efforts. And so try to see what you were doing on a normal basis as part of the continuum of efforts of the Ukrainians to resist the Russians. So it may not be shooting at a Russian soldier, but it's giving them the capacity to do that by maintaining supply chains, by keeping economic activity going, by raising awareness, by putting out information. Whatever it was that you were doing was all assisting the broader effort.
And were you there on the dime of the Financial Review?
I was reporting for the Fin, and basically I had an arrangement with the Australian Financial Review that when I was there, I was reporting for them, but also I did some TV and radio for others.
Yeah. Just because I can imagine, just day to day, who are you hanging out with? Who are the characters you're meeting? Talk to me about some incredible journalists, incredible photojournalists, even just incredible people that you likely rub shoulders with just because you're all in the same spot. It seems like a hotbed for some sort of, journalistic serendipity or, big chats about life serendipity.
You got an opportunity to meet people that you read and saw on television, guys like Jake Tapper or Mark Santora from the New York Times. I met Sabrina from New York Times, who anyone who listens to the Daily podcast, she's the host of that with Michael Barbaro. So people like that are like journalistic idols or people that stuff you consume all the time. They were there in the city, right, doing the same work. So, but the other thing too is there was always, I got some of my best contacts in coffee shops. I'd be sitting there doing work and people would approach me and say, "You a journalist?" And I'd say, "Yeah." And they'd be like, "Hey, well, what about this or that? Are you interested in this?"
Oh, that's quite interesting.
And that was actually how I ended up.
Yeah.
It's actually how I ended up getting down to Krivirig and writing probably the signature piece I did while I was there. I did a number, but actually did a really long one recently on the road trip across the southeast of the country. But I did 5,000 word piece on Zelensky's hometown, which is kind of feature on him and his childhood and growing up there. And that was pure chance. I was chatting to a guy who was telling me about something that was happening. And he was actually sharing with me live information. So this point I was making about that smartphone warfare, he was saying to me, right now, the Russians are bombing the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which a lot of people will be familiar with now, but that was happening in live time. And this was a power plant that was the largest in Europe, 10 times the size of Chernobyl. No one had reported on this, but it was on all the Ukrainian social media Telegram channels and actually been reported in one Ukrainian news outlet. And so but the Western media wasn't onto it. So I looked at it, trusted him, tweeted about it. And I was actually one of the first people to talk about it. And so that experience with him gave me the trust to he told me about this town and it sounded really fascinating. I thought, man, if I get the opportunity to go down there, I'd love to go. And then randomly he said, listen, I'm part of a convoy taking a bunch of material down to the city, Krivirig. Do you want to come? And I said, bloody oath I do. So I jumped in the car with these guys at short notice and the rest was history there. So kind of trust your nose, trust your instincts, and be friendly to people was the approach I took. And I enjoyed those exchanges with ordinary Ukrainians. I'd say even more than I did catching up with fellow journalists because they're the real people doing the real stuff.
Speaking of just jumping into random cars, to go down off a hunch, trusting your nose.
Right.
There must have been, in fact, I did write it down as a note. I don't know where I got it from. Maybe it was from your Twitter feed or from one of your podcasts, but there was a lot of, people in the city pro-Russian as well, right? I mean, sort of spies or someone pushing some sort of disinformation. Can you talk about as well, in Lviv, in Kiev, in your general interactions, rubbing up against, almost the enemy?
Well, you didn't know, right? So tensions were super high. So at the beginning, Once Zelensky declared a full mobilization, tension was obviously really high, and total mobilization being any man 18 to 60 had to fight, couldn't leave the country. Then they said anyone who wants a gun will give you one. So I was walking around in Kiev at this point. Everyone was highly suspicious of everyone, and people suddenly got AK-47s and feeling obliged to stop other people. Now, they weren't anyone in particular other than, I guess, patriotic Ukrainians saying, who are you, what are you doing? Right. And so there was a news crew that got shot at the Intercontinental Hotel in Kiev that were just down the road from me. It was kind of adjacent in the main square. I was staying at the Hyatt. And so tensions were super high, and not without cause, because we've read about this now, but there were multiple assassination squads sent in to try to kill Zelensky. But also the city itself was highly compromised. I mean, Ukraine being a border state with Russia where the cultural customs are quite similar, you can imagine the number of collaborators and Russian spies that were already in the place. And so you can understand why Ukrainians were suspicious of anyone who was taking a photo of anything. So what are you taking a photo of? Well, I'm taking it from my Twitter feed to explain to people at home what it's like. But you might very well be a spy. And in fact, subsequently, we've seen journalists that were spies for the Russians being accredited as journalists. So,
wow, interesting.
Not without cause, but for me personally, trying to trust people. When I was ready to leave Ukraine, when I wanted to leave Kyiv, I had to take a ride with two Swedish medical students and their Doberman in a tiny Kia Sonata, and because it was the only car left. Now I booked it, and they said to me, "Yep, you got the book. You got the booking. It's your car." And I thought to myself, "Great, I have to drive this thing. It's probably the last thing you want to be driving across country in a war zone, but it's got wheels the size of your hands, this thing." And but then they text me back saying, "Actually, mate, sorry, someone else has booked it." And I thought to myself, bloody hell, like, the Russians are 5 kilometers away. They're in the zoo, and tanks are in the city. And I said, you might literally be killing me, mate. Like, I need this car. So then it comes back to me and said, "Listen, this family, as you described them, prepared to take you." And so sight unseen, these lovely married couple, Swedish medical students who have been studying medicine in Kiev, took me, and we did a 16-hour trip in this car. I'm in the back seat with the Doberman. And, talk about being friends for life. Now, I don't know for sure, but, I certainly think that they saved my life. So, wow. That's the generosity of strangers and trusting people that, everyone's trying to pull in the same direction. And, I took a punt, paid off for me. Thankfully, they weren't Russian spies trying to ship me to Moscow. But those are the sort of things that you had to do. Trust your assessment of people. And if their backstory checks out, don't be completely reckless. But if people's backstory adds up and they seem legit, then there's nothing, you got to sort of take a gamble in that situation, because it's either that or nothing.
And speaking of, you got to take a punt. Have you come across anecdotes of people who ended up getting mixed up with the Russians? Or, for instance, another side of the thing, people coming in from other countries to fight the war on the Russian side?
Well, it's interesting. Again, Lviv was a staging ground for all sorts of things. At the beginning, all kinds of people and with all kinds of agendas were flowing into the country, and all kinds of, I think, materials are flowing in. And I think the Foreign Legion, I think, is a lot more organized now. At the beginning, again, it was whomever they could get was prepared to come. And I think you kind of had, anyone that is prepared to fight for another country, you'll get a mixture of soldiers of fortune, people that believe in the cause, brave people, and probably nutters, and then also people that are up to no good. And so you did get anecdotal reports of these things coming through, people getting arrested on the front line who were trying to sabotage things. So saboteurs were a big concern. And I remember I met a young guy. His name escapes me, but I met him in Lviv, and I said to him, "What are you guys lining up for here?" And he was lining up to volunteer for night patrols to catch saboteurs. So, young kid, he was a uni student, and he was like, "I want to make sure that we're catching anyone spying or collaborating with the Russians." So that was the mood then. Was you'd be pretty bloody brave to be walking
Yeah,
around
shit.
late at night in any of those cities because a couple of times when I was out reporting or doing crosses or whatever, I got shaken down quite a bit by police and others, and so um, I'm not surprised that those who are up to no good did get caught.
Mm. What about Zelinsky Zelenskey? How many jokes were made at that expense?
Mate, I was look I, about 9 months ago, no one could spell my name, mate, and now everybody
Yeah.
can spell it, right? And so people are looking and go, Zelinsky, who is this? What's his name? Yours? Misha Zelinski is not the simplest name, but no, I certainly. When I went through checkpoints, you've got to show your passport. I'll be
Yeah.
showing that, and people will be going, "This name of yours, it's a very famous name." In fact, actually, the first time it ever got raised with me, I was getting on a flight to London when I was studying at LSE, and the air hostess was Ukrainian, and she said to me, "Oh, your name. Oh, he's a new president. So he'd just been elected in 2019." I remember thinking to myself, "Oh, that's right." I remember I was aware of it, and he was a
Yeah. Yeah.
comedian. It was kind of a peculiar election because I knew that he'd played a president, and
Yeah.
and so yeah, look, it's a strange happenstance. The
Yeah.
names are so similar, and really one letter's different. And I think that's probably a transliteration thing when your family arrives down here and you say, "What's your name?" You say Zelinsky, and they just give you a bunch of letters and say, "That's now
Oh,
your
that's
name.
hilarious.
That's how you spell it."
Yeah.
So that's how a lot of people's names
Yeah.
got changed. I think when they arrived in new countries after the war. But
Mm.
I remember I had an experience when I was in Krividig, and I'd asked my fixer to, he's a mate, but effectively my fixer, to call the local government and say I was in town and keen to chat to anyone who'd grown up with the president. And somehow this has been translated on the phone as um, someone's in town looking for the president. So the SBU turned up. The SBU are the Secret Service of Ukraine. So they turn up and they said, "Who here is looking for President Zelensky?" Of course, everyone just turns around and points a finger at me. And so I'm like, yeah, that dude over there. So of course they come over and they go, "What are you up to?" And I explained the situation. They looked at my phone. And then they were like, "Oh, this name of yours is famous." And they said, "Oh, you guys related?" I said, "No, no, no." And they were laughing and they said, "We figured you must be a complete idiot because everyone knows that Zelensky is in Kiev. And so
Yeah.
why you would be in Kyiv looking for him? But we came down here anyway to find you." So, no, look, I had plenty of those interactions. And uh, it's a weird thing because, like, certainly, as I said, 9 months ago, it wasn't something I ever thought about. Now it gets raised with me everywhere I go. So
Nice.
it's I've gone from being obscure to Smith in a very short time.
All right, mate. Let's make the most of the final minutes. See if you can give me some sort of quick answers to this. It's some more
Yep.
questions regarding your time, but then as well as general questions that I try to ask every guest. And
Yep.
talk about meeting the Klitschkos. It was a great
Yeah.
photo because you're a big guy. These were fucking mountains over you.
Yeah, mate, that was like a real life Rocky Balboa versus Ivan Drago. The only difference would have been that Rocky won that fight, whereas Vitaly Klitschko would have turned me into, in the
Into a pancake.
cartoons where, oh yeah, well, like, when they would turn into like a human xylophone, like a kind of like a
Yeah.
piano accordion. That's basically
Geez,
what
that's
I
an
would have
old
turned into.
reference there.
Right, cartoons. So huge man. Like I knew he was massive, but nothing compared for how big he is. Huge man.
Yeah. And
Incredible.
nice fella as well.
Oh, a great guy. And he said the quote that I remember is he said, "The reason we're going to win because I know because in sport and war, things count for more than size and strength is spirit and will."
Nice.
And I kind of thought to myself, he has actually size, strength, spirit, and will, so he's kind of
Yeah.
unbeatable. But
Absolutely.
it was a hell of an experience.
And you rubbed shoulders with Sean Penn in the early
I did.
days. You got a photo with him. What do you make of
Yeah.
him giving Zelensky his Oscar?
Well, I think it's just showing that incredible solidarity, right? And again, we talked about ways, how do you raise the profile, how do you keep people talking about it, this issue? Well, if Sean Penn can give his Oscar to Zelensky and people pay attention and go, you know what, that's right, the war's still happening, then I think,
Mm,
it's a way for him, I imagine, to show his personal investment, but also I think there's a good way for him to garner attention.
mm,
And people say, why is Sean Penn in Ukraine? Well, he was there before the war started, so and he's gone back subsequently, and he's prepared to give, I guess, his most prestigious personal award. So,
mm.
I take him at his word that he's very personally invested in it, and he's a lovely guy. And he and I happened to be in a bunker together in the Hyatt, drinking terrible coffee out of a big drum at 4 a.m. in the morning. So the
Nice.
people you meet in a Kiev
Yeah.
bunker, mate. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've told many, many stories of sort of serendipity, and this is clearly, well, I don't want to project onto you, but it seems like it might be a life-changing experience that you've gone through. So I just want to tie, how has your life/career changed into this comment that Tim Harcourt made, who was a guest on this podcast, and I saw that you interacted with him. So I asked him about you, and he said, ask him once he returns from Ukraine whether he can put his skills towards leading the trade union and working with the Labour Party. So a very politically orientated question. So I just want to tee up this experience. You've got political ambition. How's your life changed? How do you, how do you reflect on it going into the future? What are you thinking about? I know there's about 20 things I just said, but does the
Yeah.
general sentiment of what I asked come through?
No, look, I mean, I think, look, I'm not a trained journalist, a trade unionist. Clearly I have an interest in foreign policy. I went to Ukraine because I thought I could make a difference. And you can't come out of there if you come out of there with your life unchanged after everything
Mm,
I've seen, then I think you haven't really got much of a heart. My heart is very much in Ukraine and with Ukrainians, and telling their stories is the great privilege of my life. To spend a week there is to fall in love for a lifetime. I genuinely mean that, and they are so brave, and they're fighting for all of us. I genuinely mean that too. It's not a throwaway line. I said earlier that our fates are intertwined. It could not be more so. And so, what happens in Ukraine is vital for the
mm,
future of the world, the future of Australia. So, uh, bringing it back to your question about, I'm not trying to spin my way out of it. Um, these issues matter, and we need to be talking about them in a public policy context to make sure that a country like Australia supports other countries. And we are heavily invested in a rules-based order, and ultimately our politicians are responsible for maintaining that. Obviously, civil society too, like trade unions and other bodies around the world, but it's really important. And I think that for a long time, we talked about these things in the abstract: democracy, freedom, preventing autocrats rising up, etc. And we've seen the consequence of letting autocrats rise without pushback. And unfortunately, we've seen the horrors of that inevitable, I think, outcome in Ukraine of letting bad actors continue to get away with bad behaviour. Those that hope that this will get better by not resisting it, I understand why. No one wants war, and it's horrible and it's horrific. And the closer you've been to war, the more pointless it is. But unfortunately, you can't appease your way to peace, and you can't have safety through weakness, regrettably. And I think had the world showed Putin that it was prepared to stand up to him a long time ago, I think maybe we would not be in the situation that we're in. So they're the things that exercise me: is how do we make sure that when Ukraine wins, and I believe that they will win, in fact, I know that they'll win, and they're showing that right now with their success in Kherson
mm,
and in other parts of Ukraine. What happens next, and how do we make sure that literally there are no further conflicts of this nature around the world, that we see more democracies, not fewer, that more people live
mm,
free? And, I don't know how I'm going to contribute to that, whether it's through journalism or through unionism or through labour politics or anything in between. That's what I'm most interested in, is making sure that we got a country here that we can be proud of, and that we've got a world that's safe for countries like Australia, and for people that want to live in places like Australia. And I think, our duty to one another doesn't end at the border. There's 25 million of us here, and obviously I'm very concerned about the lives that Australians get to lead. And I'm a Labor person, and so obviously those values speak for themselves about equality and the type of country that we want to have. But I think it's very arrogant to say, well, we only care about the lives of Australians. And, obviously we can influence them most greatly here, but our responsibilities don't end at the border. And so how do we make Australia a beacon to the world, but also how do we make the world more like Australia? And that's something that I'm very focused on.
Nice, mate. Really well said. 3 more. Very short, easy to answer. You're a similar age to Volk. You're from the Gong. Do you know him? Alexander Volkanovsky.
I don't.
Okay. Just wanted to put it out there potentially. All right, finally.
I don't. I should meet him. I don't, but I should.
You know who he is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. Now, these are 2 questions I try to ask every guest if possible. So the first, Misha, what's a country that you're particularly bullish on?
Ukraine.
And I suppose this whole podcast is an answer for that. But is there anything more worth saying on that point?
I just think that there's an opportunity there to, when they win, we can't miss the opportunity to build, I think, what is extraordinarily capable people into an extraordinarily capable country. I think they've struggled to shake off their Soviet past over recent decades. But I think there's such a tremendous goodwill for Ukrainians and amongst Ukrainians to step past the corruption and the oligarchs and that kind of Soviet retrograde approach to things. And the young people there, if you can't be inspired by young people in Ukraine, how dynamic they are, how tech-savvy they are, how Western leaning they are, how much they believe in democracy more than many of us do, they should inspire all of us. And I think that those people coming through, when they lead a modern Ukraine, a Western-leaning, democratic European Ukraine, I think it'd be a great place to live and do business.
Here. Couldn't agree more. I've never met a Ukrainian who wasn't like exceptional.
Right.
And like I said earlier, I work with a few of them. And they're just, So, and they've kept working throughout most of this war, despite the fact that they've got, much bigger obligations on their hands. And not all of them were in Lviv and Kiev. A lot of them, like this guy, Alexander Kucherenko, was in the east, who's in Poltava. Finally, Misha, a conversation between any 2 people of history, dead or alive, no language barrier. So it is a podcast. Who are you listening to?
Oh, it's a good one. Winston Churchill's got to be one of them because, one, he's great for a quip, just to sort of in terms of the command of language and his ability to just say things of immense importance in such a beautiful manner. I just think that that's fantastic. And to be honest, on that thematic, Volodymyr Zelensky. So I would love to see these 2 guys having a chat and swapping notes about what it's like to lead countries that have their backs against the wall in the darkest hours, literally. We know how it played out for Britain. We're still waiting to see how it plays out for Ukraine, though increasingly it's looking better for Ukraine and worse for Russia by the day. But I think those 2 guys swapping notes about what it's like would be a fascinating conversation, I think, and it's a podcast I'd tune into, mate.
Absolutely. It'd be incredible. Well, Misha, I can't thank you enough for giving me the time. I remember when this all broke out and I was actually texting you and it was incredible. So
sorry, mate. I know it was just so. As I said, I was barely sleeping, so it was hard. I had a full dance card, but I'm glad we finally got to chat and reflect on it all.
Yeah, 100%. And all the best. Thanks, mate.
Cheers, mate.
Thank you again, Misha. It was an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and I get a sense that in my lifetime you're going to become a little bit more of a prominent political voice or political presence in the Australian scene. Finally, to you, my very, very generous and dear listener. It has been an unprecedented few days of snow here in Stockholm. The contrast between the Australian climate and here at the moment is quite jarring, and I've got general musings of my mind about where could I go, but doing this podcast requires a lot of my time, and I absolutely love doing it. But to ensure some sort of production value, it ends up taking way more time than I would like to otherwise. Doing the reaching out to the guest, doing the research for the guest, and then conducting the interviews itself are all things I would happily do for free every single day. But then editing it and distributing it and trying to, get energy into the various algorithms is the stuff of nightmares for me, which is why I'm particularly bad at doing it. This is my only sort of, smart way of how I can get some sort of distribution. It is my direct appeal to you to leave reviews, to leave comments, and then we just let the algorithms do their jobs. Supposedly they should be doing their jobs, but there's one thing you can do for me, and that is to let all the algorithms know that you're listening to a Curious Worldview podcast and enjoying it. It's reviews. So you've heard me say before, pump that good juice into the algorithm. It's 5 stars across all the platforms. Let's see if we can get Spotify to over 100 before the beginning of next week. And I'm so excited about the slew of guests coming up. So I'm keen, very keen to release them. And that is all from me today. Goodbye and ciao.